I'm back from my YouTube imposed vacation off YouTube. Thanks a lot, guys. What's up, everybody? I guess I'm gonna refrain from talking about all things medical, at least for now, because apparently I've been misinforming all of you. At least according to the Ministry of Truth. At any rate, I had opened, quick announcement, I had opened an alternate channel called New World Order. I'll put a link to that somewhere. So if you want to follow me there in the case of another top down imposed vacation off YouTube, well, at least this channel, go on ahead, follow me there. Today we're going to continue the conversation about atheism and God. Mainly because, well, I had 2 weeks to listen to some debates and to ponder about such matters, and I had been getting this comment here and there, people asserting that atheism has basically, won the debate, at least as of late. Christianity or God in general has been debunked, and just this nonsense. Oh my goodness. I mean, to leave such an ignorant comment, either you haven't been paying attention, or maybe it's because you lack God, right? You can't grasp, you have a difficult time grasping logic, you don't know how to be coherent, you don't comprehend things that are being said, what's happening in this world, or more specifically in this ongoing debate. Right? You lack logic, reason. You can't see things for what they are because you lack God. Seeing as God is, or maybe some religions would say provides or guarantees. I'm not part of any denomination, okay? I have my own ideas. Not to say I'm not inspired by some of the things some religious people say, people that belong to certain denominations, but ultimately, I don't recognize any church authority or anything like that, okay? There's only one authority, and it's not man-made. But basically, and I think, did I just make a transcendental argument? The reason why atheists, and I'm not talking about agnostics here, okay? The reason why atheists are incoherent is because they lack God. God being the guarantor, or God being truth, logic, reason, morality, right? So on and so forth. At least that's obvious to me. At any rate, I was checking out this very good video by Trinity Radio about T-Jump, seeing as he's been one of those new atheist sprouts. And I thought TR did a good job nipping that in the bud, basically. So I saw a comment on there that I will read, and I will also read my response to the comment as somewhat of a guideline, outline for what's happening in this video. So just to give you a quick synopsis, and I encourage you to watch this video if interested, because it was really good. TR over here is basically accusing, in maybe not in so many words, maybe I'll put my own spin on it, obviously I will, but basically he's accusing T-Jump of doing that which people like Ask Yourself do when debating veganism. They basically invent these impossible scenarios, or these very unlikely scenarios, or these tiny little, as he calls them, pinholes they could crawl out of, simply because they are not willing to concede that the other person's position is rational, right? You don't have to agree, but if you had God, honesty, truth, logic, reason, you'd be able, at the very least, to admit that those people are making sense. You don't have to agree with their interpretation, or you don't have to believe what they believe, but you can't say it's irrational. But that's basically the problem with atheism, and I guess we'll get to that as we read this comment. So TR has a problem with the really high standard of proof for God that these atheists demand, right? And Christopher Powell answers, look, the high bar of evidence requested isn't a function of atheist hyperskepticism. It's a function of the grandiosity of the claim, right? High bar of evidence isn't a function of hyperskepticism. Isn't that what hyperskepticism is literally, right? This person is incoherent. He lacks God. It's a function of the grandiosity of the claim. What's the claim, right? And depending on what the debate is, claims are different. Atheists seem to think that every single debate between a theist and an atheist is to prove God's existence, right? And they just have this tunnel vision, and because of that, in my opinion, a lot of the times they're unwilling to grasp what the debate is actually about. Not every debate between a theist and an atheist is about proving God's existence. Most of them are not, actually. Anyway, hyperskepticism is, by definition, requests a very certain certitude of evidence, or puts a very high bar of evidence on everything, right? That's what hyperskepticism is by definition. If you're gonna talk about it being the function of the grandiosity of the claim, tell us what the claim is. But if you'll tell us what the claim is, it's likely that you fail to comprehend what the claim actually is. He failed to comprehend what TR is saying in this video. And if you go watch and listen, you should be able to grasp it if you have God. Certainty isn't an ingredient of knowledge, continuing. What you do need is justification, right? And what could possibly justify a finite human's omni claims about God? So there's plenty of justification for God. In my opinion, the transcendental argument, especially the version that J. Dyer presents, is exactly that. It's a justification, right? Or maybe more precisely, God is the justification for, reason, logic, and all these transcendental categories. But seeing as it is circular, and at that level, claims at the paradigm level, as J. Dyer puts, are all circular, couldn't you use that to justify God, kind of like I did in the beginning of this video? Look, I'm no genius, all right? I'm just a little bit smarter than your average moron, okay? On a good day. So you don't have to agree with the things that I'm saying, and if you see flaws in my reasoning, point them out, all right? Don't just bitch and moan about it, just point out the flaws. It's all good. Anyway, so yeah, there is a justification for God. Like, for example, the fact that the world in which we live doesn't at all seem random, but it seems there's evidence of design, right? Who did it, how they did it, and all that other stuff, okay, that's debatable, very debatable. But to say that you don't see evidence of design in the world, you think all of this here is random, I mean, come on, man. Like, can we just at least be honest? You know what I mean? But that's the problem with atheists, right? They cannot be honest because they lack God. If you don't like people asking for more evidence than you can give, stop writing checks that your epistemology can't cash. He already answered that question in the video, so I won't bother. And by the way, the standard of evidence he requests isn't a pinhole. He's just asking for you to demonstrate explanatory virtues of the God hypothesis. There's no reason in principle why it should be difficult to make novel, testable predictions about a God that actually existed and interacted with the world. Novel, testable predictions. What this sounds like to me is using science to try to prove God, right? But the question that I would have, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but this is what it seems like to me. The question I would pose is, how do you prove? Why are you asking proof of the metaphysical by means of science? That doesn't make any sense, right? It's not even a logical or coherent question, right? You lack God, basically. How are you basically asking someone to prove a metaphysical being by means of, like the microscope or something, or the scientific method? It's a metaphysical being, but either most atheists don't understand metaphysics or they completely reject metaphysics, right? Until it's convenient to make metaphysical claims, right? And then they make them, but that's the incoherence, right? Of these new atheists or atheists in general. They want you to prove a metaphysical being, right? A supernatural being by means of science. It's idiotic, right? It's incoherent. So this was my reply to his comment, and I'm going to expound on some of the points that I'm making. Hyperskeptical is a code word, just as new atheist or the phrase, I simply lack belief in God, right? This is my claim that I've been making for a while, and I've been able to crystallize it a little bit more. It has become a little bit clear to me what it is that I actually mean. These people are dishonest, and I'll explain. They just use code words, right? They're first of all, they changed the meaning of atheist, right? But I think it's in the comment here. So my analogy is as follows. I lack belief that my worker will show up tomorrow, but I will never argue him when he says he will, even if I am hyper skeptical that he will show up, right? I may argue it if I don't actually want him to come, right? But I would rather just be honest and tell him that I don't want him to come. Don't come to work today. I'll just say that, right? If my worker says he's coming and I'm hyper skeptical about that, right? I'm not going to argue him unless I don't want him to come, right? Why are these atheists arguing? Why are they so adamant about arguing people who believe God exists, right? Clearly because they are convinced God does not exist. If they simply lack the belief, why would they get into these debates? For what reason, right? It doesn't make any sense. That's the dishonesty I've been talking about. For the new atheist, it's a very dishonest way of saying I am convinced God doesn't exist, which used to be the honest atheist stance. But due to the grave losses suffered in the debate, the atheists had to retreat to assume the current dishonest position simply for the sake of not losing the argument as badly as before, right? So atheism, like 10, 15, 20 years ago, it meant God doesn't exist, right? I believe God does. I am convinced God doesn't exist. That was the claim of atheism, right? But then they realized, because again, they lack God, they lack logic, they realize they can't win that argument because it's not impossible, but it's extremely difficult to prove a negative. Well, I mean, in certain contexts, it's not that difficult, but when it comes to making universal claims about a metaphysical being such as God, it's damn near impossible to prove that he doesn't exist. And if you think there is a way to prove that, you let me know. But because atheists took a beating in this debate by taking this stance, right? They had to become dishonest. They had to change their stance for the sake of the argument because they can't win that argument. That's what they believe. They're convinced God doesn't exist, but they can't say that, right? So theists in this debate, they made the atheists retreat, right? They knocked if this were the fight game, right? They knocked the atheist out and made him go back to the drawing board and change his style of fighting, right? Completely rearranged their tactics and made them go from being honest to dishonest. Okay? It's not like atheists just changed their mind, right? I mean, and if you did, then you have to admit defeat. Either way, you lost, right? Or you're losing currently. So for people to come here and tell me that atheism has claimed some kind of victory in this grand debate that's been going on for quite some time now, you're completely out of context. The atheists retreated, right? They went back to lick their wounds, and they came back with a new strategy. They got their ass whooped. That's what happened. They were made to change their entire strategy completely. So how are they winning? They were made. Did they change their mind? So now you're telling me that now they allow for the fact that God may exist? Really? Because that's not what I see in these people when they come to the debate. They're still not allowing for that possibility, really, if you just read between the fucking lines. But if you want to tell me that they honestly changed their position from saying God does not exist to I don't believe God exists, right? That's a concession. That's a loss. Atheism had to reinvent itself. They had to change the meaning. I think it's dishonest, but either way you look at it, they lost. At least the first round. In my opinion, they're getting pummeled in this debate. So for anyone to come out and say that, like, the atheist has gained some kind of a victory when their entire philosophy, the whole method was completely changed and rearranged, or they just became less honest, they became dishonest. What kind of victory is that in a logical debate? When you have to completely change, revamp, go back to the drawing board and reassess your position. What kind of a victory is this? You guys saying this, presumably you're atheists, right? You're like God. You're illogical. You're incoherent. So I'm convinced God doesn't exist used to be the atheistic stance, right? But due to the grave losses suffered in the debate, the atheists had to retreat to assume the current dishonest position simply for the sake of not losing the argument as badly as before. Now, just as God, this isn't something I can prove with absolute certainty. I would need your cooperation to agree, right? But that would require honesty. You'd have to admit that I'm correct, which, atheists, and look, just because if you truly lack the belief in God, to me, you're an agnostic. That's it. Atheism could be correct. Maybe there is no God. But as a worldview, it cannot be true, in my view, seeing as its main axiom is dishonest, right? Again, I can't prove that, but are you saying that it's unreasonable to say this, given everything, all the evidence I've just given you? Just listen to these guys debate. Do they act like someone who simply lacks the belief in God? No. Come on. Anyway, continuing. And as such, seeing as the main axiom of new atheism is dishonest, and as such it still loses the metaphysical debate every single time. Whenever you have a metaphysical debate with an atheist, and you know what you're talking about, they lose the debate every single time. They cannot justify metaphysics, right? While claiming to be skeptics, meaning if you're a skeptic and you can't justify something, you have no warrant to use that something if you can't justify that it exists. They can't justify logic, but they want to use it all the time, right? But if you're a skeptic, you should be skeptical about the things that you cannot justify. But no, logic exists because I say so. right? When pressed hard and long enough, the new atheist always turns out to be incoherent, dishonest. Sam Harris, for example, asserts, this is a debate he had, I think it was with William Lane Craig, if I'm not mistaken, something like a decade ago. He literally said that math is subjective. And then he said morality is subjective, yet 10, 20 minutes later in that same debate, he said universal moral axioms exist. So which is it? Like, you're incoherent. How are there universal axioms when morality is subjective, right? How do you rectify the two? I don't know. It seems like a contradiction to me. But people swoon and they're so impressed by Sam Harris. They cannot see through eloquence or high verbal IQ or a certain demeanor. They cannot see past the superficial and actually consider and judge the things that he's actually saying. See if he's being logical. They cannot see past the superfice, right? Because they lack God. It's very easy to lead them down, to lead them astray, because they don't have God. They fall prey to the devil, basically. Now, you may not agree with the words that I use to describe these paradigms, but that's basically it, right? They're naive. They're super naive. Obviously, this doesn't apply to agnostics, who truly do lack belief, but keep an open mind, right? One last thing you seem to have missed here is that religion is based in faith. Faith is belief, obviously. How does that square up with your demand for absolute proof? So this guy, obviously religion being a belief, this guy wants like absolute proof, which religion cannot provide. Now, if you change the definition of knowledge or how much evidence you need to claim to have knowledge, right? It really depends and it fluctuates, just as he alluded to that by saying that, he's hyper skeptical, right? You could be hyper skeptical, you could be skeptical, you could be not skeptical at all, right? And depending on how skeptical you are or not, knowledge is going to mean something different to you, right? But ultimately, religion is faith, right? So it doesn't profess, obviously it cannot profess to have absolute certainty because it's faith, right? So this guy doesn't even seem to understand what religion actually is. So how does expecting absolute, incontrovertible proof or certainty, how does that square up with the fact that religion is faith or based in faith? And if religious people had absolute, incontrovertible proof of God's existence, it would probably no longer be called religion, but it would be something akin to scientific law, right, or physical law, or a theorem, right? It would be a fact accepted by everybody, right? Duh. The atheists are fucking incoherent. It's ridiculous how whatever. Let me not use epithets. Do you see the incoherence I mentioned earlier, right? Can you see how incoherent you yourself are? I think your rejection of the reasonable grounds for the God hypothesis is merely a projection and further proof of your incoherence. If all you had was lack of belief, you would accept even a modest amount of evidence as sufficient for the belief in God, right? If all you did was lack the belief, it wouldn't be that difficult to convince you that it's at the very, you don't have to believe yourself, but to convince you that it's okay to believe. If all you do is just lack belief, right? It shouldn't be that difficult. If there is, and there's plenty of evidence, right? I'm not saying incontrovertible proof, but there's plenty of evidence for God or designer, right? A guarantor of logic, reason, truth, morality, right? And morality, in my opinion, by definition, is objective. So when I say morality, that's it. It's objective. right? If all you did was lack belief, then it wouldn't be that difficult, given all the evidence we have, to convince you that it's okay for some people to believe, if not you yourself, right? But because the new atheist requires absolute proof, for me, that's a projection of the fact that they are absolutely convinced that God does not exist, right? They require grandiose evidence, right? Because their claim is grandiose. That's why they require grandiose evidence. When religious people, for the most part, and I'm not saying that some of them don't fall into the trap of not defining what they mean by knowledge, not having that common ground with the atheists that they're debating, where they kind of end up assuming the burden of proof that the atheist requires. I'm not saying that sometimes they don't fall into that trap, right? But the coherent religious person getting into these debates, the intelligent one, obviously they understand that it's a belief. Ultimately, it's a belief. And to have belief, you don't need as much evidence, obviously, as you need to be certain of something. And if a lot of religious people are certain of God's existence, that's probably usually based on personal experience, more so than all the evidence available to all of us, right? So once again, new atheists require absolute proof for God because they are absolutely convinced that God does not exist. And they project that onto the religious person who's not making a grandiose claim that God exists in general, right? For the most part, that God exists without the shadow of a doubt, and you need to believe it. I've never heard anyone make that claim, right? They qualify what they mean by knowledge, and they explain that generally, especially with the transcendental argument. And then they claim to have knowledge, but it's, at least the way I understand it, it's not a scientific type of knowledge, which, is questionable in and of itself, but it's not, it's it's a different argument. Again, you cannot prove the metaphysical by means of worldly things, right? By means of science or something like that, or the scientific method. So again, the new atheist requires absolute proof because they are absolutely convinced that God does not exist, okay? And that's why they're dishonest. And they project that onto the Christian person in this case, who simply believes because there's enough evidence to believe, right? And that's all that they want to convince people of. At least people who practice apologetics, right? There's enough evidence, especially when you compare the two paradigms, right? The one that's coherent is the religious paradigm. It's the God hypothesis. That's the coherent one. Whereas the atheistic one doesn't make any sense. And they always end up talking out of their ass and putting their foot in their mouth, saying dumb shit. So the new atheist cannot even be honest about what it is that he truly believes, right? Because he cannot be honest because they lack God. So someone like T-Jump will use these as, what is it, TR again? Yeah, TR calls pinholes to wiggle out of the argument, right? Just like ask yourself in a vegan debate, we'll invent a non-human human being, right? Something that's like impossible or so highly improbable, or aliens or something like that, so as to not admit that the other side is making sense, right? You press them hard enough, they bring up these hypothetical scenarios they themselves don't even believe. And T-Jump is a classic example of this. He will use, or I haven't seen him like fully develop this idea in any debate. I haven't seen all of his videos, obviously. But he will allude to pantheism, for example, as a counter argument when he's arguing with a theist, right? From, let's say, the Christian perspective. He'll say something along the lines of, well, we could explain the things that you use to explain or to justify the Christian God, we could do the same thing with, like, everything being God, pantheism, basically, right? Or some other kind of deity. So basically, an atheist is using a form of theism or deism or whatever you want to call it, right? Some kind of a God concept, philosophy, to debunk a theist, right? So if you're an atheist, why are you using theism, whatever the form of theism is, why are you using theism to argue if you're an atheist, right? It doesn't make any sense. There's a couple of debates that I heard from T-Jump when he was arguing a theist, and he was arguing for God. It was just a different kind of God than the theist believed in. So you got this atheist arguing for God against a theist. The guy's completely incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. He uses these hypotheticals that he himself doesn't actually believe in. And if he does, I mean, right? But this is the problem with a lot of these atheists. They cannot justify logic, reason, or any of these things, but they feel like they have a warrant to use all of these things, when their own ideology says, or philosophy, if you want to call it that, says that if you cannot justify something, you shouldn't believe in it. They cannot justify logic or reason or any of that stuff, but they use it to argue. They believe in it, right? That's self-refuting. Their whole worldview is self-refuting. And you see an example of this, again, with someone like Harris saying that morality is subjective, but there are universal moral axioms, saying something like mathematics is subjective. It's just a product of the mind. Or Michael Shermer basically saying that truth and logic is just a creation of the human mind. And just getting exposed as a complete buffoon by, I think it was Frank Turek in that specific debate, right? You get someone like, ask yourself, talking about a non-human human being, a human being with the humanity removed. You get someone like T-Jump appealing to authority of scientists, right? Some scientists. But he's hyper-skeptical of religion. He's hyper-skeptical of the God hypothesis. And yet, without having, conducted any of the science himself, simply trusting in the honesty and the ability and, Jesus Christ, what's the word right now? I can't think of it right now. Let me take a sip of my coffee. Competence. Trusting in the competence and honesty of the scientists, right? To make claims about the natural world, because he read an article somewhere that says this or that, right? He never conducted the science himself. He never actually read the studies critically, right? He didn't put them to the hyper skeptical standard that he puts the God hypothesis to. He takes all this science that fits his worldview on board without being at all critical about it, right? He completely ignores, the rich history of fraud in science, and just acts like all of it is just legit, or at least the stuff that supports his worldview, right? Without ever having read any science critically. And I know he hasn't. And if he has, he's either ignorant or incompetent, right? But he doesn't question any of the science, and he literally appeals to the authority of some scientists, even though there's a lot of scientists who disagree with those scientists, right? He literally argues for God as an atheist, not the Christian God, but some kind of a deity, right? He supports some kind of theism when it's convenient to debunk this other kind of theism as an atheist. Like, these people are just completely and utterly incoherent, right? Illogical, But according to some of you out there, they're winning, even though they got spanked so hard they had to completely change their entire position and go back to the drawing board and come back with, again, if you don't think they changed their position, then they're just being dishonest. But if you want to tell me that they're being honest, right, in your opinion, theism has completely redefined atheism, okay? But atheism is winning. How retarded can you be? I don't know. That's my video. Anyway, long ass ramble. I guess I'm a little bit out of shape, but I got lots of ideas for all kinds of different videos. Some of them are going to be on the new channel, so check that out if you feel like it. And thanks for watching.